All right, David, last week we had our bishop with us. This week we have a bunch of youth who are kayaking on the Jamaica Channel behind us. So if people are kind of looking distracted, it may be because, one of the youth has fallen in or something like that, but hopefully it won't be too distracting today. Thank you.
Wow, what an exciting church you are. All kinds of.
Thank you.
All kinds of.
Thank you again for joining us, and
Yeah.
for this is the last in the series, so thank you for this wonderful series, and I'm looking forward to, I think we've had at least a few people who have done a bit of the reading for this last book,
Sure.
So I'm looking forward to hearing your insights and theirs.
Okay, very good. Well, in fact, I thought it might be interesting to ask, and it's absolutely no problem what people have read or not read. I think this session will be interesting and hopefully enriching for you, whether you've read some of the book, all the book, or none of the book, because we're going to read some interesting passage from it, and I'll try and explain what's going on in them. But I'd be interested to ask at the beginning, have some of you read some or indeed all of the book? And I was going to say, if you have, great. It's a few hands. It's hard for me to see exactly. Let me just... I wanted to give an opportunity before I get going. Once I get going, it may be hard for me to stop. And there's a lot to read here. Did anybody have any comments or questions about what they have found interesting or confusing or particularly striking? Yeah.
I thought about the title of the book all the way that I was reading through its 1,100 pages in the edition that I have.
Okay.
And only seldom was there any reference to that title.
Yeah.
There was one
Yeah.
brief passage in which
Yes.
Mal, who's quoted all the way through, but only that
Yes.
one time in which we
Yes.
see this. So it seemed clear to me, trying to make sense of this, that this was meant to be symbolic, that surely this was referential to somebody more important in the book who came more than once. And for me, that was the figure of Robert Askey, who came through the book and was representing, trying to preserve God's church. And if we could see him, who after all was tortured to death, it seemed that he would be someone who could be associated with the man on the donkey in the Bible. I can find no other figure in the novel with whom I can identify that Christ figure other than Askey. What is your comment on that?
That's very interesting. Very interesting. That's a plausible and interesting analysis of it. I haven't, and I have to say, very little is written about this book, so I can't say there is if you like, a sort of standard interpretation which I'm going to insist on. I've read virtually nothing. I've searched online as well and found virtually nothing written on it, so I'm just giving my best shot. I've not read it like that. I would agree with you that I think Ask is, of the main characters other than Mal, I think Ask is by far the most attractive, the most sincere and self-sacrificial in his bearing as a Christian. I think he's the figure to whom we're most drawn and for whom we feel most sympathy and respect of all the characters, possible exception of Mal. He's a completely different kind of character from Mal. I think the man on a donkey, I mean, the one vision that the two visions, I was going to refer to that today. One of the visions is of Christ on a donkey. And so, in that sense, I would say we are perhaps Prescott is encouraging us to think of Christ as the man on a donkey, just as he is in the New Testament. And you're right, though. I think I think your question is a very good question. It raises, why does she not make more of this? I was just looking at some passages, preparing for today. There are a few visions of Christ she has. There's one that's referred to where she sees him in the form of a little child. She also sees him in the passage we read not last week, 3 weeks ago, when he comes to the priory and sits and drinks and tells tales with everybody. And then there is this scene a bit after that where she sees him crossing the bridge in the nearby village on a donkey. And yet that scene is not really described very much at all. So it is a bit elusive, but I think that Hilda Prescott is such a skillful architect. I mean, this novel is so carefully constructed, in days, years, it's, I don't think that's a mistake. One of the things that I think is going on is this whole theme of, if you like, the elusiveness of God's presence in this world. And as I'll show you, I hope, in what we look at in the words of Mal, I think Mal, this illiterate, marginal figure, is the one who sees Christ and who is closest to Christ. And she is entirely on the margins of things. She makes nothing happen. There's all these powerful figures like Henry VIII, Cromwell, and others in the novel. And even at a lower level, people like Aske, who are powerful, dynamic figures seeking to make things happen in the world. But she is the one who is closest to the heart of reality. She's the one who has seen Christ. But Christ is precisely on the edges of things. There's all that stuff happening in London. Christ appears in a village far away from London and power. And I think one of the themes running through the novel is all these powerful people from Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell downwards claiming to represent Christ and his church and his cause. And they are very far from the truth. Christ himself is closest to a totally illiterate, poor peasant woman. And maybe even the very fact that the scene of Christ, that the scene of Christ on a donkey is not described in a very graphic or full way, is almost in some strange way bearing witness to that. I'm just thinking on my feet, but why does she not describe that scene more? It's because that scene is, as it were, given to us, is mediated to us through Mal. But that's a great question, and maybe my answer will make a bit more sense when we've looked at some of the key passages I want to draw attention to. Thank you for that. I think that's got us off to a very interesting start. Probably we ought to dig into these passages quite soon. Does anybody else have any particular question or comment that they'd like to mention before we get going? So if not, I think we'll dive in, because there's plenty to read. And I want us, particularly those of you who've not had much time to look at the book, to experience just the beauty and the power of Hilda Prescott's writing. Okay, let's dig in. Let me just give a quick reminder. Are any of you here who were not here 3 weeks ago when I introduced the novel? Right, yeah, there are. Good. There's a few of you. Well, you have a handout, or Father Nicholas has some here, which he can give you, which I gave to those who attended 3 weeks ago, in which I said a little bit about the author, the historical background, and how the book works. Let me just very briefly summarize what I think will help you from that handout in order to understand the passages we're going to look at today. So most of the action of the novel takes place in the mid-1530s, 1535, 36, 37. The period shortly after King Henry VIII has broken from the authority of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, and he has been declared to be the head of the church in England. And we have a sort of split happening within the church in England between those people who are faithful, loyal Roman Catholics. Robert Aske is one of the leading figures of that kind. By the way, I don't know whether his name is said Aske or Aske. I'm no historian, so I'm not deliberately correcting you. I've just always thought Aske. You may well be right. I'll say Aske, though that's what I have in mind. So Aske is one of these faithful Roman Catholics who are very upset about the way things are going. They are very upset about one of the major policies of King Henry, which is to dissolve the monasteries, to suppress the religious communities of England. And in the end, Aske will be caught up as leader, he sort of stumbles into it almost by accident, of this uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is a popular Catholic uprising which very nearly succeeds and could have really had enormous consequences if it had succeeded. But that's one of those what-ifs moments in history. So we have Catholics like him. On the other hand, we have people who are drawn to the Reformation, or evangelical Protestant ideas, returning to the Bible, returning to evangelical preaching. And this figure in the novel called Gib, or Gilbert Dorr, is a priest who is drawn to the Reformation ideas. We have characters like that. So we have this great division, religious division within England, and people seeing the cause of Christ in very different and opposing ways. And then, so that's the historical background. And then the novel foregrounds with several characters, several historical figures like King Henry and so on. But the figures on whom we particularly focus include three whom I'm going to look at today. One is called Christabel Cowper. She is the prioress of Marwick Priory, one of the religious communities that I was just mentioning. And at the heart of the novel is the drama of whether this priory will be closed down or whether she will be able, through her political smarts and her connections, she's from a quite significant family, whether she can bribe the authorities to keep to prevent her priory from being closed. So that's one drama that's going on. She is a very capable person, perhaps a little bit too pragmatic. One slightly doubts the depths of her spiritual integrity in certain respects, but she's a complicated figure. And then there is Robert Aske, who you were mentioning, who is this devout young Catholic lawyer who becomes leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace. And then there is Gilbert Dorr, who I mentioned, a priest who is drawn towards Protestantism. So those are the three of the principal characters. And then there is Mal. So Mal is, as I mentioned, this illiterate, rather strange figure who shows up one day at the priory. Nobody really knows who she is. They don't know where she's from. She's an eccentric, physically unattractive character. But in religious and spiritual terms, she is really, I think, the person through whom the author Hilary Prescott channels the most important spiritual insights. She has visions of Christ in and around the priory and the local villages, and this becomes known about, and it's a talking point at one stage. She's even taken down to London, and her claims are investigated. At one stage, she's even interviewed by Archbishop Cranmer. I think that's a fiction. We have no record of any character called Mal, but she's in the novel. She's interviewed by Archbishop Cranmer. She's a very unworldly figure, not seeking attention for herself at all. And I think I mentioned 3 weeks ago that a key feature of the novel, which I saw more clearly the second time when I read it, is that each of the five main characters, I just mentioned three of them, because we only have time to look at three of them today, but each of the five main characters at one stage ask Mal separately about her visions. And they are essentially wondering, wow, this sounds very impressive, this sounds interesting. Do these visions, do they hold out, if you like, a word of encouragement to the cause that I am supporting? They're all separately thinking, do these visions suggest that God is saying to us, I'm going to intervene and I'm going to make the cause of truth and of Christ triumph? So they're all drawn to Mal, and they want to ask her, tell me about these visions and what do they mean? What do your visions suggest is going to happen? What's God doing? And I realized, I think the second time I read it through, just how fascinating these moments are. And I think the way the novel is structured, it seems clear to me that the author wants us to notice this. And you'll notice as we read them that Mal says exactly the same thing to all of them. And in one sense, they're all left wondering what on earth she means. So let's turn now to some of these passages. We're going to look at Christabel, the prioress, and then Sir Robert Aske, and then the priest Dorr in their engagement with her. So if you could turn first to page 378. In the handout, it is the first of the passages that has a yellow line down most of it on the side. So you need to turn a few pages into the handout. Page 378. Now, the background to this scene is that one of the nuns, here named as Dame Marjorie, has just come in great excitement to tell the prioress that it's being said that Mal has had visions of Christ. Remember, the prioress is a very powerful, competent woman from a good family, well placed in society. What really drives her is the desire for her priory to survive the great upheaval that is going on. She's concerned for this institution of which she's been a part for some 25 years. She doesn't want to see it collapse. And we're going to see here now a fascinating encounter where this very powerful figure, Christabel, the prioress, encounters Mal. So at the top of the page, Dame Marjorie whispers to her. I hope you can all follow where we are. And now, so Dame Marjorie whispered, and she saw him ride on the donkey across Grinton Bridge. The prioress kept her eyes upon the candle flame for so long that when she looked up, she could see nothing for the floating light that still dazzled them. Where is the woman? The prioress asked. Dame Marjorie began to explain how Mal had been along the riverbank, gathering pussy willow for the palm cross tomorrow, but the prioress cut her short. Where is she now? Up the dale side after primroses. Dame Marjorie pointed up towards the hill behind the priory and found herself alone in the still room. The prioress came out of the gatehouse and looked upwards. At the top of the open, steep slope, under the edge of the woods, a woman in a brown gown moved and stooped. A little lad was with her. That was Mal, and the lad was the priest's bastard. Only when she began to climb the hill did the prioress remember that she had not asked why Dame Marjorie was so sure that it was a vision sent from heaven. But that, she thought, I'll find out better for myself. When she had gone some way up, she stopped for breath. As soon as she had it, she called Mal by name. The two above turned and looked down. Then the lad slipped away into the woods. The prioress beckoned with her hand and waited for Mal to come down to her. She didn't watch her as she came, but instead looked down to where the whole priory lay spread out below her, the great court, the nuns' court, the orchard, all the farm buildings and the church, like the picture of a priory, the world she knows and loves and wants to save. The servants were busy in the great court. A woman came out with buckets swinging on a yoke and went into the nuns' court where the well was. Behind the stables, a man in a red hood was carting dung. She knew that Mal stood beside her and turned. She looked, stared, then lowered her eyes from the creature's face. Never had she supposed that such a look could be. It was not a smile. It was not a light. What? The prioress began and must stop to clear her throat. It came to her with a shock that now she feared to be told what the woman had seen. She would have been glad to go away without another word said. But she drove off the fear. What else but good should God, Our Lady, and St. Andrew intend to their servants? Yet she knew that of that good she was as much afraid as if God were her enemy. Come, she said, and heard her own voice, harsh, weak, and strange. What is this thing I hear? What have you seen? With a wrench, as it were, she took her eyes from Mal's face. When she did that and looked down again at the priory, her mind steadied. Mad as a goose, she thought. That look is of her folly. I shall say to her, Fie, fool, hold your tongue of these things. But when she looked at Mal, she could not say it. Mal said, There was a great wind of light blowing and sore pain. The prioress shivered. A tide of air, snow-cold, steady and strong, rushed by them. The morning's blue was now threatened by a cloud that rose and darkened across half the sky. With her eyes on Mal's face, the prioress began, fumbling her words in a way that the convent did not know. If you saw, if it was shown, I pray you, she got it out at last. What in your mind is God's meaning to us in this showing? While she waited, the wind shifted and rustled among the grass at their feet. Against the deepening darkness of the whelming cloud, the frail green mist on the elm trees was visible as it had not been against the bright sky. And far away along the fringes of the wood, the bare ash branches showed white like clean bone. Suddenly the cloud broke in a snowy shower, so that looking up, the prioress saw 1,000 flakes spinning down sharp white against the looming grey above, and so hard frozen that they rattled among the oak leaves in the grass. Marek, the prioress cried, coming to the heart of the matter, was it shown to you of our house? Shall it fall? Not our house and the church that's hallowed to God and his mother and St. Andrew, not Grinton Church, she pleaded, though she cared not a button for Grinton Church. But Mal did not answer, and at last the prioress turned away and went slowly down the hill. By the time she came back to the great court, the sky was clear again, and the clouds sailing in it, light and bright as suds. The tower of the nuns' church took the sun bravely. It was of stone and built upon stone, but as the prioress looked at it, it seemed to totter and her heart failed. "Jesus," she cried under her breath. Then she realized that only the fast-driven cloud behind it moved. The tower stood firm. "And shall stand," she muttered, and ground her teeth together, while her fists clenched at her sides in the folds of her gown. So that's the encounter of the very powerful, very eloquent, always in control prioress, who's reduced to stammering by her encounter with this illiterate peasant woman. Hold that in mind, and you'll see there's something of the same pattern with the other characters. What I hope you also picked up here is he's hoping that the vision speaks of God intending to uphold her priory. She wants to, as it were, enlist God's support for her great cause. Notice how Mal just has one thing to say, and then she's silent. So, this powerful woman is reduced to a stammering silence by this powerless woman. Let's go on and look at the next scene. You'll see something of a pattern emerging. So if you move on, a couple of pages to the next yellow marking in the side, it's on page 408. Here we come to a scene which introduces to you, they've been in the novel for a while by now, Sir Robert Aske, who is against the closure of the monasteries, against the break with Rome. He's a faithful Catholic. And on the other hand, Gibb, or Gilbert Dorr, this priest who is sympathetic to the Protestant Reformation. So they are backing different causes, if you like. In this episode, they're shown talking to each other briefly. Aske has just had an accident and has been injured, and Gibb is helping him limp home. Now they start to talk about important things. So we're just a little way down page 408. So it was abruptly that Aske opened his matter. "Sir Gilbert, from all that I can hear, you are one of those who teach heresy to the simple poor folk." "Sir," said Gibb, very harsh, "that you call heresy, I call the true word of God." "That I call heresy, general councils of the church have called heresy." "As what?" Aske bit his lip as his foot turned on a stone. "I'll not dispute it with you," he said shortly. "You know well enough what things are contrary to that which the church has always taught." "Ha!" cried Gibb triumphantly, "but now it is all to be reformed. The king and the vicar general." Aske cried, "Out on Thomas Cromwell! Is he to make and unmake what men should believe?" "Yea," says Gibb, "he and the king, because that is the work to which God hath sent them. You have seen what is done already, superstitious practices forbidden, the Pope's authority broken, carnal, ill-living monks and nuns driven like conies out from their berries." Aske stopped and took his arm from Gibb's shoulder and faced him on the road. "I'll hear no more of this," he began, but Gibb did not wait for him to finish. "Aye, but you shall hear more of it. The work's only now begun, but the field shall be reaped clean, and it is the king that has laid his hand to the sickle." Okay, so there you get a sense of these two different men, Aske and Gibb. Going to turn on now to the next page 411. See the yellow highlighting again. Now, just a few moments later in the same story, Gibb comes back to the priory, and Mal sees him and comes and helps him with his injury. Which is interesting. She has, as it were, the healing touch. Which also, she's compassionate and has a healing touch. And then at the top of page 411, they have this conversation. This is Mal and Robert Aske. Mal sat back on her heels. "There, master," said she, "I'll help you stand and bring you to the gate." "No, no," says Aske. "Wait a minute." He had never, except that first time when Jack had spoken of them, taken much account of what he had heard of Mal's dreams or visions, or whatever they were, having heard at the same time that she was but a crazy creature, and knowing how poor folk will make a marvel out of nothing. It was, he had thought, a gold chain to a duck's egg. That means it was probable that whatever she had seen was but part of her madness. But now, having talked with her, he knew that though she might be simple, she was certainly not crazed. And if simple, might not God have spoken to her simplicity? Suddenly, with relief, Aske felt his own littleness, as he had felt a few moments ago the greatness of that which stood round about to shelter. He said aloud, but it was to himself that he spoke, "It is sure that God must prevail." And he leaned forward, laying a hand on Mal's shoulder. "Tell me," he said, "has there been a word given to you or a sign shown that God will come to our help?" Mal said, "There was a great wind of light blowing and sore pain." Exactly the same words as she spoke to the prioress. She lifted her head so that now he could see her face. He got up hurriedly from the bench. She got up too and stood. It was he who went down on his knees and knelt in front of her on the grass. After a moment, he uncovered his eyes and, drawing a deep breath, let it out with, "Deo gratias, then it's true, you saw him, tell me." When she said nothing, he instead began to tell her, but as if she knew all about it, how he needed, how we all need, we that fear, that think, he broke off, "I have needed the comfort of that blessed sight which was shown you." But when she still was silent, he cried, as if in anger, "Him that the Jews crucified, you saw ride in triumph? It was in triumph." He caught at her gown and shook it, but Mal made no answer. So again, we have another figure, a powerful figure, not on the national stage, but somebody who is about to become a figure on the national stage as the leader of this uprising, very capable, eloquent. Again, in his case, there's an attractive humility about him. This gentleman kneels. I mean, he really sees, I think, the sort of spiritual sincerity and power of this woman. And he kneels before her and really wants to learn from her. And yet, even with him, Mal just says one thing and then is silent. So there's this great sense, she's in nobody's pocket. She's not intimidated by anybody. She's so simple. She can't read, but she just speaks what has been shown to her. And she says it exactly the same each time. There was a great wind of light blowing and sore pain. Mysterious words. We'll come back to how we understand those. But he cannot enlist her to his cause. I think one of the themes running through this is that attempts to enlist Christ to our own cause are never quite going to work. We can seek to serve Christ, but we can't claim that he is necessarily, as it were, just completely committed to backing our cause. I think that's one of the themes here. Let's go on now to see Gibb Dawes' encounter with her. Turn on to page 428. So the last two characters are, broadly speaking, on the Catholic side. They are both people who resent, who are very angry with the closing down of the convents and so on. Now we have the Protestant sympathizer, still a priest in, if you like, the old church, but he is somebody dissatisfied with the old order, wanting things to move in the direction of the Reformation. And Gibb, so halfway down page 428, where the yellow marking begins, Gibb found Mal sitting by the door. She stood up and bobbed to him. Now, he said, speaking sternly, tell me this, why are you turned out? She's been kicked out of the priory by this stage. For that which I saw. For that which you saw, what did you see? He asked her, though he knew well all the talk of her seeing our Lord himself riding the peddler's donkey over Grinton Bridge. He had sworn to himself that he would never speak to her of it, telling himself that if he heard her speak the words presumptuous, blasphemous, he would come near to striking her down for her wicked folly. But the fact was, he dared not take the risk of finding that so poor an ignorant creature as she had in truth seen this wonder. Now suddenly, because of the pride of the prioress and because he had routed the fellows she had set on, he dared take the risk. And if the thing were true, he would make it ring in all men's ears. They should not silence him. Come, he said. Mal was silent, standing with her hands hanging and head bent. Come, he said more sharply, brought his face close to hers, for it had grown very dark in the church. He drew back, blinking. It was not that there was any brightness in her face, seen dimly in the dusk. Rather, it was as if, peering at her, he had looked into some shadowed, secret place in the woods, and there found the scent of violets, or heard water running sweetly. Mal said, there was a great wind of light blowing, and sore pain. Gibb found himself bumping against the sharp corner of the founder's tomb, and only then knew how he had turned from her and moved blindly away. He gripped the edge of the chiseled stone, while his thoughts ran this way and that in confusion. He was hugely angry and glad. He was angry because she had seen this thing. He was glad of the thing which she had seen. He was far more angry with the rich and great, whom Christ in his righteousness had come to judge. Now, he thought, we shall see the day of wrath for those who turn their faces from the gospel. Now the Lord comes once more wearing a poor man's coat, and poor men will follow him. He came back to Mal. This means that the hour has come. In this vision, God speaks through you to me. It is time I lay my hand to the plough. It is time I go out from the dale to proclaim the day of the Lord. This was the meaning of that other showing. He saw himself, gaunt and fierce as one of the ancient prophets, preaching and exhorting endlong and overthwart all England. I shall be greater than Trudgeover. Trudgeover is one of the Reformation, was one of the evangelical preachers, a traveling preacher of great renown. I shall be greater than Trudgeover, he thought. I shall be a new forerunner. I shall tell them of the crowd of poor men that went along the road, jostling and thrutching, tearing down of branches, throwing down of coats, crying, Hosanna. That is the meaning of what you saw, he said to Mal again and more urgently. The day of the Lord, Hosanna, he shouted at her. But Mal made no answer. So, we see the pattern. In each case, the person with quite different views of what the true cause of Christ is in the middle in 1530s England is wanting confirmation from Mal that his or her cause is being supported by Christ. And Mal just says what she saw. There was a great wind of light blowing and saw pain, and then makes no answer. She refuses to be, as it were, enlisted, taken up into anybody's cause and controlled, as it were, in that way. So we have these three meetings with Mal. What does it mean? What do I think that Prescott is saying through all of this? Well, these characters are all a confused mixture of good and bad. Aske is, as I said, by far the most attractive of the characters. Even he has his faults. And through and in Mal, it is as if Christ has come near. Christ is not present in the Archbishop of Canterbury down in London, or through various other powerful representatives claiming to present his cause. It's through Mal that Christ has come near. These figures are all drawn to Mal. They want to understand her, but they cannot. They are reduced to stammering, to fear almost before her, although all she does is say simply what she saw and then be silent. What about these words she spoke? There was a great wind of light blowing and sore pain. I think they're deliberately mysterious words. They aren't an obviously traditional Christian formulation, but in those words, there are obviously core Christian themes around the mission of Christ. Wind, the wind of Pentecost of the Spirit, light, Christ is the light of the world, and sore pain, the passion of Christ, the suffering of Christ. She seems to see the essence of the meaning of Christ. This illiterate nobody has, as it were, grasped the heart of the gospel. Others catch glimpses of her genuineness and are in awe, and they seek to, as it were, kind of not exactly manipulate, that's perhaps unfair, but to co-opt her into their causes, but she won't be. And I think the theme there is that somehow in all the turmoil of the world, including the clashes, the divisions within the church, Christ is present and will not be co-opted. It's not as if he is perfectly present on any side of this particular clash in 1530s England, but he is present. That he's present in those who are truly humble and simple-hearted and see him and bear simple witness to what they have seen. It's a very profound theme, I find. And then in later parts of the book, we get more and more of these sort of beautiful, simple words from Mal. Let me just give you one or two more very briefly before we close. If you turn ahead, just turn over one more page, you'll find on page 523, some more time has passed now. And Mal is just talking to this young lad who is actually the illegitimate child of the priest Gibb. He himself is he's just a little boy. He can't understand what she's saying, but she chats away to him some of the time, just talking about mundane things. And then suddenly sayings of great spiritual depth and power come out. In the middle of page 523, she says this, just a few lines from the end of that section from October the 26th, the middle of page 523. Speaking of Christ, she says, and it wasn't that he put on man like a jacket to take off at night or to bathe or to play, but man he was as man is man. The maker made himself the made. God was ungodded by his own hand. She put her hands to her face and was silent till what pulled them away. He was God, she said, from before the beginning, and now never to be clean God again. Never again, alas, she said, and then, Hosanna. It is an extraordinary reflection on what we call the incarnation, God becoming man in Christ. You just get these pearls of, as it were, Christian insight and wisdom through this peasant woman. God was unguarded by his own hand, through his own action, through his own choice. God, as it were, steps out of heaven, distances himself from his glory, and adopts the humility of a man. One last section I want to include is, I think it's one of the passages which those who've read the novel find most moving. It's right at the very end. If you could turn to page 710. This, I think, also points us to the purpose of Prescott in this novel. Gibb Dore, the priest, is a very agonized figure. He's had an illegitimate child. He knows he's a spiritual failure. He's behaved badly. He has great ideals. He's quite educated, quite intelligent, quite an energetic figure. But he despairs of himself. We saw earlier that he'd hoped he might become a great preacher, but he doesn't. And here he is at the very end of the novel, we're going to have this glimpse of his despair, but also the kind of theme that he hasn't understood God's grace. And the real theme running through the whole novel is that in the midst of all the turmoil, the power plays, the conflict, the brutality of 1530s England, God's grace is silently present and available for all people. So just in the second paragraph on page 710. So in his despair, for now he knew that though God might save every other man, Gibdor God could not save. Once he had seen his sin as a thing that clung close as his shadow clung to his heels. Now he knew that it was the very stuff of his soul. Never could he, a leaking bucket, not to be mended, retain God's saving grace, however freely outpoured. Never could he, that heavy lump of sin, do any other than sink and sink again, however often Christ, walking on the waves, should stretch his hand to lift and bring him safe. Gib did not know that though the bucket be leaky, it matters not at all when the bucket is deep in the deep sea, and the water both without it and within. He did not know because he was too proud to know that a man must endure to sink and sink again, but always crying upon God, never for shame ceasing to cry, until the day when he shall find himself lifted by the bland swell of that power, inward, secret, as little to be known as to be doubted, the power of omnipotent grace in tranquil, irresistible operation. That's right at the very end of the novel. There's just a few pages after that, but I think the takeaway for me is this. Hilary Prescott paints a fascinating story, which is also very interesting for its political intrigues, not just for these moments of theological insight. The clash of great powers, great historical figures. If we ask ourselves, where was God in all of that? Her answer is that, God is closest to figures like Mal, who are not in the heart of the political action at all, who nobody knows about, who are uneducated, illiterate, and that everybody who is striving through their own power to bring about the triumph of what they see as Christ's cause, whether it's the prioress, Robert Aske, Gibdor, they're all in the end failing to do what Mal does, which is simply to be still before Christ and recognize the wonder of who he is, and that in him God's presence and God's grace is there for everybody. Even for Gibdor, who is a failure, he doesn't know that God's grace surrounds him, even in the midst of his failure. So I think there is this sense at the end of it all that this terrible period of British history, fascinating but terrible, brutal period, in the end, the interpretation of it that she offers is God's grace is present for those who have the humility to see it, to be still before it, like Mal does, and like some of the others are just beginning to see in her. Sorry, I've taken a little bit longer than I meant, but I hope those readings gave you at least some sense of the book. I know some of you will need to be getting on to your service. I'm around for however long you have time for, if anybody has any comments or questions.
Yes.
Could you comment briefly about Julianne?
Yeah.
She strikes me as a very sympathetic figure. She idolizes Aske. She proposes to him. She wants to go into the priory, but she's rejected because her sister, no fault of her own. She becomes pregnant, but it isn't clear who's the father. Is it really her husband, Lawrence, or someone else?
No, I think it is the husband.
Okay.
Great character. So there is this character, Julie, who is kind of a teenager. She has a much more powerful, much more beautiful older sister who Aske loves, and called Meg. She is one of the five characters. She is a sympathetic character, but again, she approaches Mal, hoping that her great fear is that Aske will be killed because he has led the uprising. And she is looking to Mal for reassurance that that will not happen. And even that, Mal cannot give. The working of God's grace in history doesn't protect any of us from suffering, from heartbreak, from tragedy. I think that's the kind of theme of her story. And she is married off to a much older man, a decent older man, through whom she has a child. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think, her story is, and she is the one who reads Julian of Norwich, and maybe there's a kind of play on their names, Julian of Norwich. She also struggles. There are moments where young Julie, reading Julian of Norwich, cannot bear the idea of the kind of suffering of God, the bloodshed involved in God's suffering for the world. So even she, who's a very innocent, as it were, tragic figure, she's again another of these characters who doesn't get it in the way that Mal does. Her life is very sad. Ultimately, it's a tragic story, and I think it ends in sadness. I don't want to spoil the story by saying what happens, because for those who might read the story, I think that would be unkind. Yeah, but thank you for raising her.
Any last questions or comments? I was struck as you were saying, as you were describing it, that not only does it seem like the